Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock in the Eastern Time Zone, and I am Chris Weave, and this is Starfleet Tactical. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming. As always, I am not speaking for any employer, past, present, or future. And I am here tonight. We're going to talk about Albedo, which is the just wonderful, lovable, absolute shit show that that I started talking about last week. And I'm going to continue talking about it tonight because it's so cool in so many ways, even though it's so broken in so many ways. And some of you out there have expressed some of you have said that you haven't heard about this thing before. Others have said, oh yeah, I've known about this for a long time. I was not able to go through and do one of the things I wanted to do, which is sort of do some of the math on the ship design to see whether the ship that they were presenting us as one of the examples from one of the supplements was actually a usable ship or not. But I am going to go through and show you some of the floor plans, some of the deck layouts, and talk a little bit about how the FTL drive works and the strategic implications of the FTL drive. So it's mostly going to be about the deck layout stuff, and I'll do some commentary on that. And as is always the case with this, I'm going to show you a lot of illustrations that come from these works. They are available sort of haphazardly as PDFs from Drive-Thru RPG, but there's a lot to critique in these works, and so I'm going to try to. This is an extended critique of the product. And I should emphasize two things. One is that this is a product that I absolutely love. And the second thing I should emphasize is that the people who did it are, to the best of my knowledge, all still alive, and they may totally and completely disagree with what I have to say. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and pull up tonight's episode. I remembered to delete Alex's name last time. You may recall I forgot to delete Alex's name because I had used an old episode as a template. This time I remembered, so I'm one ahead of last week. Not last week, a couple of weeks ago, because I was traveling this past couple of weeks. So I remembered I re-listened to the last episode. And I finished the episode saying, see you next week. And it's like, yeah, I knew at the time I wasn't going to see you next week. I meant to say, see you next episode. So speaking of next episodes, here's what the schedule currently looks like. Now, there's a lot of green there. That green is probably lying. One of those green ones is probably lying. Maybe lying. It'd be better if it were orange. The problem is I don't know which one. Because at some point I'm going to go visit my sister. And I may end up turning that into a trip all the way to Des Moines. And if I do that, it's 50-50 as to whether I'd actually do a show or not. My brother's getting ready to move. I would normally do it at either my brother's house or my dad's house. And my brother's getting ready to move. And there's other reasons why I'm not going to do it at my dad's house. And so for that reason, if I go to Des Moines, I probably won't do a show unless DeLon is either not moved yet or he's finished his move. And so that's the case. You see there's the next 3 to 5 topics. My ability to count to 5 has gotten increasingly dodgy because I've added one other thing there that wasn't there before, and that is the idea of I want to do an episode on the Franz Joseph designs. Triangulum Studios has been, over the course of the last few years, has gone through a bunch of the Franz Joseph stuff, and they just posted a very, very interesting video that talked about the somewhat fraught relationship between Gene Roddenberry and Franz Joseph, that they started off very much friends. You know, they both appreciate each other's work, and that Gene Roddenberry, basically, Gene is a complicated guy, was a complicated guy, and basically, if you ever implied that somebody else might have had something to do with Star Trek, he apparently got very testy about it. And he famously had these rules on how the ship design worked, and it had to do with it had things like the two engines had to be within sight of each other. There had to be a clear line of sight between the two engines, and you always had to mount them in pairs, and you had to do this and you had to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And according to this very interesting video that got me thinking about the subject, he invented those rules specifically so that he could say the Franz Joseph stuff doesn't meet the rules. And he invented the rules after Franz Joseph came up with the stuff and after their relationship had fallen apart. And so that led me, I'm going to talk about that some, and I'm also going to go through the Franz Joseph designs and sort of talk about the things that are implicit in that, and probably a little bit of talk about Starfleet battles in there also. Starfleet battles actually has a very different set of technological assumptions, as does Franz Joseph, from all the other canon sources and even semi-canon sources. So it's worth sort of going through all that stuff. And I talked with Pat Doyle as he was literally in the cockpit, as he put it, creating his nest in the cockpit, getting ready to fly his skybus someplace. And I said, hey, would you like to do this? Because, of course, he's an old Starfleet Battles player. He was a Federation commander, national champion. He wrote the tactics manual for it. So he's much more familiar with the Starfleet Battles universe than I am. And so I want to pull him into that. So that's the plan for that. So that's how that got added. But there's plenty of stuff to talk about. I'm going to try to do Outsider next week, because Outsider's it's a web comic. If you do a search for Outsider comic, you will find it, and you can read all the technological background stuff that they got there under the Insider tab. I'm going to go through some of the stuff there because it's a really good companion for the part that's going to be at the end of this talk. Okay. I also added another thing here. I'd like to point out 8 through 10 April did I, you know what? Oh yeah, 8 through 10. 8 through 10 is the middle of the week. That's why it's not red there. 8 through 10 is the middle of the week. 8 through 10 April, I'm running the Connections Online Professional Wargaming Conference, which is something that's my other COVID project, was to start an online wargaming conference. If you are interested in professional wargaming and the intersection of professional wargaming with hobby wargaming, do a search for Connections Online. Give me a couple of weeks, because we're not at the point where we're ready to do registration yet. It's really cheap. It's like $5 for 3 days worth of events. 8 through 10 April is the core presentations. They're from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. But we actually start doing some extended events on the 7th, and we'll finish up on approximately the 12th. And that's like if you want to play games online, and there's some extra lectures and stuff like that. But the core is 8 through 10. The topic this year is Wargaming Future Technologies. And it'll all be available on YouTube a couple of weeks afterwards. So if you don't feel like paying the $5 to see it, but you'd like to see it, just do a search on YouTube about, beginning of May, and it'll all be available and you can watch it. Okay, let's see. As always, my opinion is not the opinions of my employer. As I said, I'm going to be critiquing this stuff. Not all the images belong to other people. I am not trying to violate anybody's copyright. I want to do critique, and I want to have a discussion about it. So that's why I'm presenting all the stuff. So I'm going to do that. Okay. So here's the agenda. All the stuff in gray we did before, but I'm going to do a quick refresher. I'm going to go through some of the slides from before, but a lot faster this time, just to remind everybody what albedo is. And then I'm going to do some deck plan stuff, some layout stuff, and sort of talk about the layout stuff. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the jump drive, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategic combat stuff. Those last two bullets are one slide each. But there's a lot to say there, so I expect it's going to be more than just a slide's worth of talking on my part. As you've seen this image before, this is one of the Aerodynes. It is basically a surface to orbit capable device that is used as sort of a combination dropship and Harrier and all the rest of it, close air support and all the rest of it. And that's the high quality type image. That image is the one that sucked me in, because that was in the back cover, the back of the box of the original boxed edition. That is what turned me into an Albedo fan. And when they want to, they have some really good artwork. But one of the recurring themes is sort of phoning the artwork in. Most of the artwork is not as good as this. In fact, I think a lot of the stuff that we see, a lot of the things I'm going to show you towards the end, because I've got a bunch of extra spaceship images to show you, I think a lot of those were basically just stuff that Steve Galactica just sort of drew for, doodled away at, and they made it available. so this stuff is, every now and then you get some really, really high quality stuff. Like there's some ground equipment that's got high quality images, but a lot of it's just kind of phoned in. Okay, so this is the other really high quality image. This is a small FTL courier scout type ship. It comes from the first and second edition. It claims to be hard science, and it's not as hard as it looks. They don't use any magic words in there, but they do have some magic capabilities. For instance, they seem to imply that you can have fusion rockets that are at you're doing a steady thrust the entire time, despite the fact that that doesn't make sense. What you're going to want to have some sort of spin section if you don't have artificial gravity, because sometimes you might be in orbit. Sometimes you might want to be in the place you're at and not be jetting all over the place. You might be conserving fuel. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you'd want a spin section, and yet none of the stuff we see really has it. That illustration is sort of interesting. You don't see any other illustration that's got that level of detail in a cutaway of a ship. And it's also got this very interesting opening in the center of the deck, of the habitable portion, which is the non-grade in portion. The grade in parts are fuel tanks with baffles. The other parts are, there's a center open column, which they talk about in the game book as being a passageway. And you never see that in any other illustration of any ship layout in the entire series. Only in this one illustration. They highlight it, they show it in this one illustration, they say it that all the ships have it, and then they don't show it. And that's kind of, in a nutshell, sort of gets to the editing of this, is that the entire way through, individual sentences make a lot of sense, but when you string the sentences together, they don't, because they're inconsistent with each other. Okay, tactical space combat using lasers, high velocity slug throwers as primarily defensive weapons. Offensive weapons are something called autonomous combat vehicles, which are basically smart missiles. They don't have their own weapon systems. They're kinetic kill vehicles. Why didn't you just call them smart missiles? I don't understand, or torpedoes or something like that, but they're autonomous combat vehicles, but they do their combat by slamming into stuff. Combat is not a surprise. You're moving across the system. They make a big point of saying that it's a minimum of 2 weeks to get from one jump point or to the planet or wherever. They talk about months, sometimes it's months of transit across the system, and they see you coming because you've got your magic fusion torch the entire time, so they see you coming. Combat is managed by AI. The purpose of the humans is to do the pre-programming and to do damage control afterwards, but when you do sort of the high-speed pass, the robot runs it all. And the combat system as it's presented is really an RPG combat system. It's not really like a board game combat system. It doesn't have that level of fidelity. Here's a sort of an example of ship types. That funky one on the right, I'm going to show you another illustration of that down the line. Here's another discussion of ship types coming from a couple of different sources that don't agree with each other. The takeaway here is look at how big these ships are. A frigate is 20,000 tons. That would be a cruiser in anybody else's Navy these days. Back in that would have been battleship sized. Back in the days of like the HMS Dreadnought, that around that time period, that would have been a battleship. They talk about carrier capital squadrons, but a squadron is very small. The numbers just don't make sense. You have this, there's like the VLCCs that are 5 kilometers long, and you assign 2 ships to escort it. It's like, it just doesn't make any sense. Okay. So commonly ship design has a 1-to-5 ratio, so it's 5 times as long as it is in diameter, and all the habitable decks are kind of in the middle, and it's a modular ship construction. All of the words that you see here, you're going to see in a later slide. I just wanted to refresh the idea that what we're going to be looking at is the part that's in that box there, the habitable sections. Okay, so now we're ready to start the part 2 part. And so here's another illustration of some of the different ships. That other illustration, that the one in the slide before, was from the ship source book. This is the one that was in the original RPG. And note that thing in the background that's huge, that's labeled small FTL courier. That's like that really high detailed illustration I showed you. That's what that thing looks like in comparison to the size of all these other things. As you can see, the autonomous combat vehicle down there at the bottom is like the size. It's bigger than one of those Aerodyne gunship things. I mean, those are pretty good size. And the spacesuit on the left, I put that in there because this is an illustration of like how detailed he got about some of this stuff. It makes a lot of sense. It tries to be hard science fiction. That looks like a very, very believable suit. It even includes this idea that little sort of trapezoidal thing in the front. If I remember correctly, it says something about how if you're a bird, you can have a different little thing there so that your beak can stick out in that little space. He thought through, because of course it's furries. He thought through a bunch of that stuff, but it still sort of falls flat when presented in the game. Okay, so these are words. Most of these words you've seen before. The difference here is that we're going to look at some common hull sizes: 24 meters, 32, 40, 48, and 60. Now, he talks about vessels as big as 80, and then he talks about the VLCCs, which are also known as VLCSVs, very large command carriers, very large command and support vessel. That's the original name for it in the first two editions, and the third one is in the third edition. That first one is in the third edition. Those things are like 1 kilometer by 5 kilometers, but they'd have you believe that there's nothing in between the 80-meter hull, which would be about 400 if it meets that 1-to-5 ratio, which it probably doesn't. The bigger they get, they have a tendency to get squatter. But even if it did meet that, that's like 1,400 meters, which is like, it's just a little bit longer than the really, really big thing is wide. You'd have you believe there's nothing in between. That doesn't make sense to me. I'll also note, at no point do you see anything that looks like a fuel carrier, right? So you'd think that there would be a refueling ship that would go along with the fleet. You don't see anything like that. So there's lots of holes, some of which fit in from the idea that this is not something that's derived from current practice, right? They don't have the old standards. There's no equivalent of AM radio because they never had AM radio in this world. This is a world that was sort of created as its own thing at a high technology level. You sort of find out in the comic book it's because it's kind of an experiment that apparently humans were doing. So they created at a high technology level. They don't have a military structure, a naval sort of background to pull concepts from. But, the idea that you might need a refueling vessel doesn't strike me that you need to understand about modern navies to understand the idea that you might need a refueling vessel of some sort. That's just me. That funky vessel that I pointed out a couple of slides ago, there it is right there. It's a heavy lift booster. As you can see, it's actually an air breather. It's a surface to orbit thing, and one of the ways that it gets to being a surface to orbit thing is it actually uses air from the atmosphere to decrease the amount of oxidizer that it has to bring along, or at least to increase the amount of working fluid. I think it's not really about oxidizer because it's not burning the stuff. It's fusion reactors. It's heating a working fluid that it uses as a propellant. And so in this case, it's heating the atmosphere. And as a result, you don't have to use it from your propellant tanks. And so it's more efficient, at least for the lower part of this. I don't know whether this particular design, whether the numbers would actually work in the real world. My guess is they probably work in the game universe world just because he's using magic fusion torches that really just don't make sense in a lot of ways, including their placement. Why wouldn't you put them at the very back? Why would you want your rear cryogenic hydrogen tank to be right next to the big flamey thing, as opposed to safely distance away from the big flamey things. But instead, they've got the engines mounted in a ring around the outside, and it doesn't really make any sense to me. Okay. Let's see. Looking quickly over, I see a lot of usual names, including Mike DiCarlo. Hi, Mike. Good to see you here. I see Stephen Ross and Wright Sublette and Eric Henry and Todd Zurcher. And some of those names I recognize from SF Consumel. So thanks, guys, for coming and visiting. Let's see. Okay, so here, now we're going to do deck plan layouts. And I did one real quick that I put some color in just to give you an illustration. There's either 2, 3, or 4 elevators. Those are those blue portions there. And so they, those are elevators. And then you've got the orange in here are bunks. Now, last week I talked about how they don't stack bunks. They talk about how sometimes they might stack bunks, but they generally don't, because the bunk has, underneath the bunk, it has some life support stuff, and above the bunk, it has some life support stuff. Every bunk sort of functions as its own independent little life support capsule. In the U.S. Navy, you have bunk beds in officer staterooms. So, you know, even an officer who's normally by himself, if they have passengers on board, they have writers on board, augmentees that are there for some reason, like, for instance, the CNA analyst who would go aboard to do an exercise reconstruction, they might just assign you to a space with an officer, and you would get the top bunk in his space, and you'd have your own desk there. Normally he'd have 2 beds and 2 desks, and he'd use one of those of each, and then, but there's space for somebody else to come in and be there. They don't generally do that in here. They don't generally do that in Traveler. Traveler does not have the excuse of all this extra life support equipment. In Traveler, they just apparently never invented the technology of the bunk bed. One of the things about these different layouts is that supposedly they're all modular. They can slide in and out of the ship, and you can buy used modules, etc. And in some cases, they're split. Like, for instance, this 24-meter hull on the left-hand side, you can see there's that line down the middle that it sort of implies that you can buy half of that layout. But one thing to keep in mind when you look at all these is, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line to split them into modules? Because the place where you draw the line frequently doesn't make any sense. Like, for here, you're going to draw it through the middle of an elevator shaft. Okay, maybe. Why? Why would you do it there? On the right-hand side, where do you draw the line? You can't, my guess is probably in the right-hand side, you're drawing it down the middle of those sort of radial corridors, and you're drawing it through the middle of an elevator shaft. Okay, that works. Oh, one cool thing about those elevator shafts is that they said that most of the time, they don't actually use the elevator. They park the elevator at either the top or the bottom. And those elevator shafts have, they can be made airtight. So they have a door that slides out. They slide the door out partway to sort of form a landing. And they've got ladders on the side, and you climb up and down the ladder. And then you get on the landing and you press the button, and it opens the door, and you go in, and it closes the door. And so that's how you use it. Most of the time they don't actually use the elevator. They basically use the elevator in special situations. Note also that elevator isn't moved by cables. It's got to be moved by linear induction motors, because you've got all these doors that are opening and closing on either side of it, presumably. So yeah, that's all. There's some very interesting things there. They could have spent an entire chapter talking about elevators. If you go to Tom Scott, he's a YouTube guy. He did a very interesting visit to the ThyssenKrupp elevator building in Germany, where they do elevators, and they've got an elevator there that uses linear induction motors, and it can not only go up and down, but it can also go sideways. It's basically a turbo lift from Star Trek. Germans have actually invented the turbo lift from Star Trek, and you can go watch a YouTube video on it. Okay, so let's look at the 24-meter hull. At one point, I thought about trying to make them all a common size, and no, I just decided not to do that. It was going to be too hard to try to standardize the size, and then you'd have some of them that would be very small and some of them would be very big. To be honest, I didn't even really play a whole lot with getting the alignment right on these. I just sort of put them on the slide. I should have made these a little bit bigger so they'd be a little bit more readable. The one on the left, you'll see it's got that funky sort of, half of it's bigger than the other half. And that's because it's the reactor weapons deck. And if you remember correctly, where the reactors are, where the engines are, it flares out. And so what you're seeing there is the couple of meters of extra space that you get from the flare. And so those decks are actually physically bigger than the other ones. And they also talk about how those decks are generally done as one unit. And so you might have multiple decks and you've got this sort of housing outside of them, but those decks generally, they don't split them up, even though this one has a line down the middle that kind of implies. But I think in this case, they're just basically showing two different kinds of things. I don't think it's actually the same deck. And they're a little inconsistent in that regard. The other one's the hangar deck, but I don't really see how it's a hangar deck, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. A couple of slides down. Here we have a command center, and so sort of look at how many guys you got there. You've got, 8 guys there, plus a center seat, and then on to the right-hand side, you have a typical quarters sort of deal. Oh, you saw where the beds are. That other thing there that's got the circle in it and what looks like an open door, that's the bathroom. So, but you'll notice there's nothing that looks like a closet or anything like that. They've just got this empty space. Very minimalist drawings, way more minimalist than I would expect, given what the fact that this is something based on a visual property. There's a 32-meter hull. You've got a command deck, and it's got 3 elevators on that deck. And so think about where you'd actually split it. And then sort of a living area also with maybe I think that's a sick bay, if I remember correctly. I'm having a hard time reading it because it's very small on my computer. If I put it on my larger monitor, which is above this, I'll spend the entire time looking like this. And I try to put it on my laptop monitor so I'm actually looking in the general direction of the camera. Okay, so here we have a weapons deck. And so an ACV deck. So you've got this big thing that looks like a revolver that rotates around and has up to 8 ACVs in it. And it can spit them out. And then it's got 2 bays that you can use to fix them. Now note, those 2 bays, I think I measured it, and you can just barely get 2 ACVs in each of those bays. And so if you want to treat it sort of like, a submarine going around and having a bunch of stows, but it also has stuff in the torpedo tube, you could actually not load 8 on this deck. You could load 10. Okay, but what if I need to do maintenance on an ACV? Well, we know from Traveler, the mercenary cruiser in Traveler has these carried craft that have modular cargo pods. And the way they switch the pods in that is they actually have the ship come out of its berthing area, dump the pod out into space, go back in, grab a pod, pull it out, dump it into space, grab the original pod, go back in, load it back into storage, exit once again, grab the new pod, and then go in. And that's how they swap pods. And so it seems to me that you can probably do something similar here. You can probably, if you need to do some maintenance and you need to move them around or something like that, you can poop out a couple of ACVs, rotate it around, pull ACVs in, go around, poop them out, get the original ones, move whatever you need to move to the space you need to move it, and then pull the other ones back in. So you can probably You can probably dense pack it. Means that you can't be accelerating when you're doing those sort of evolutions. Means that it's a pain in the ass, just like on an aircraft carrier. If you got too many planes on the flight deck, it's a pain in the ass. This is incidentally why U.S. aircraft carriers never carry a full load. They can carry like 80 planes. They usually carry about 65, 70, something like that. They can carry 80 to 90, and that's because it's like a full parking lot, right? Or moving furniture in your house, right? If you got no furniture in your house, it's easy to move furniture. If your house is really tight, it's hard to move the furniture. Same deal here. But this is one of those things, when I looked at that, that's really cool. Now you look at that maintenance bay, it's like, it'd be nice to see what sort of other machinery they have there, but it's just not there. Okay, here's a 40-meter hull. The thing that just drives me crazy about this 40-meter hull, in addition to, when I look on the right-hand side, you're like, okay, I'm assuming that it's like 3 wedges that you can, 3 modules. Where do you put the lines for the modules? Where's the dividing line? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's all one unit. But when I look at the hull on the left-hand side, you've got the command deck and the auxiliary control on the same deck. So that's not necessarily as bad as it sounds. And the reason why it's not as bad as it sounds is that if you've got 2 ships that are coming at each other, maybe one's decelerating, but if they're coming at each other and they're launching ACVs at each other, chances are if you get hit, you're going to get hit on the front, and it's going to be a penetrating shot that goes straight down. It does seem to me to be the case, though, that you might want to have these things like one at the top of the stack and one at the bottom of the stack to get some vertical separation. We see that in the supplement, The Drift, which is the one that talks about the ship that won the battle but was virtually destroyed in the process, where in that one, the folks in auxiliary control lived because they did have vertical separation. The guys at the top all died, the guys at the bottom didn't. And so why would you ever put auxiliary control on the same level as your main control? It just doesn't make sense to me. Okay, roger that. A couple of other ones. The one on the right is a hangar deck, and you can see it's got some big doors. Seems to me those doors should be bigger than they are, because you could make them bigger than they are. And I'm interpreting that, it's got a little boarding tube thing. You'll see that boarding tube again later. Okay, so here's a 48-meter hull. It's a little bit smaller. I put them in because there was only 3 illustrations. So there's the 3 illustrations for the 40-meter hull. All the other ones I had 4 illustrations for, so I put them 2 per slide because I couldn't fit 4 on one slide and still have them readable. This one I was able to sort of make it a little bit bigger. But, nothing terribly special there. Next one, that's a pretty cool one. It's got an ACV deck that's also got a hangar bay there, so you can see, and you can imagine an aerodyne being slid in between. There are several aerodynes because it's a 60-meter hull, right? It's 180 feet. Those aerodynes are not 180 feet long. You could carry a pretty sizable craft in there, which makes me wonder, why they don't have anything that looks like a fighter. But you could conceivably have something that looked like a fighter that carried ACVs that allowed you to sort of spread things out a little bit more. But they don't have that. And you've got 2 ACV launchers there. And you can see the boarding tubes there as well. And the interesting placement of the elevators to get you right to where the boarding tubes are. Okay. These are just generic 60-meter hull sections. They didn't really define them as well. I will say about the one on the right, so let's assume that that's 4. It's got 4 elevators. It's probably 4 wedges, 4 modules. Where do you draw the lines for the modules? I don't know where I draw the lines on that. Wherever you draw the lines, in fact, I'm almost inclined to think that must be a solid deck. It's not one that's split up. And the reason why I say that is because it's almost has to be the case that if you got one of those, you'd have to get the exact same thing in order to get it to match up. So you wouldn't really have the option of mixing and matching on the one on the right. And so if that's the case, then okay, maybe they just do it as one. Okay, now let's talk about the jump drive. So I talked about the layout stuff, etc. Let's talk about the jump drive. The jump drive is really, really interesting. The write-up of the jump drive comes from the ship's source book. The original write-up of the jump drive was in a short-lived gaming magazine called Vortex. It was written by Steve Galactica himself. I happened to stumble across that episode of that issue of Vortex in a game store and bought it because it had this Albedo article on the jump drive in it. And then later, when the ship source book came out, I found that again. And basically, the way this works is that it pushes off the mass of the star. The jump drive works by, when you activate the jump drive, you get this shove from the star. And it shoves you directly away from the center of mass of the star. So you have to be aligned precisely on where you're going to go. At the other end, it talks about that it will, at the other end, it also pushes you a certain amount, but it also talks about pulling you in. And it's sort of a little confusing. Though I think the illustration here is the right way to think about it, is that you're on a hill and you roll down the hill until you get to another hill, and then you roll up the hill and you fall out of jump space. Other stars along the path can push you out of the way. And so as a practical, there are two things that sort of define how far you can jump. One is the path that you have. Other stars can push you out of the way. And so some paths aren't clear. The other thing is you can only be in jump space for a certain very, very small amount of time because jump space is weird and hostile. Specifically, it has different physical laws, and including one that says everything above the atomic weight of oxygen will start to sort of randomly fission. And you're okay for a little bit of time because there's sort of like an inertial field. There's some sort of residue of the fact that you came from our universe that it takes a little bit to dissipate, and it takes a little bit for the physical laws of jump space to sort of latch onto you. And by a little bit, I mean nanoseconds. And so you can only stay in jump space for a very short period of time. So between this idea that you have to avoid other stars, you have to have a clear path, and this idea that you can only be in jump space for a certain short period of time, it basically works down to you can do about 5 to 30 light years per jump. And so if you don't have a star to jump to, then you don't have anything to push off from, and you're kind of hosed. So your path is determined by stars that are 5 to 30 light years apart, and the ability to get a clear path there. Your vector is preserved. So if you're still pointing in the same direction, you're still moving at the same speed, which means that you've got the added complication that if you're jumping to a star that's going in a dramatically different direction than the star you're coming from, you might have an issue there with just, having enough fuel at the other end to sort of catch up to the star that you're going to, right? The star is going in one direction, you're going in another direction. You might have to do some radical maneuvering. There are some other constraints there too, like you have to be a certain distance from the star you're leaving from. Otherwise, you have this jump erosion effect. You have a tendency to leave matter behind. And so you can do an emergency jump that if you're at least 85% of the distance away from the star for that size star, you can do an emergency jump. But hey, you roll your dice, take your chances. So there's some issues there that you have to be aware of. And the other thing is that if you turn on your drive, the star's gonna push you. And so if you try to do an in-system jump, the star's gonna push you halfway to the next star, and in whatever random direction, center of mass directly out. So you can't do an in-system jump with this thing. You're limited to only jumping in between stars. You can't use it for local travel. And so it's a very interesting situation all around. Now, that illustration in the lower right-hand corner is not from Albedo. That illustration in the lower right-hand corner is from Outsider. the comic that I'm going to talk about next session. Outsider has a jump drive that is very similar, but not entirely so. It ends up with a very similar set of constraints. And one of those, this is a really good illustration that you sort of have like, you have a jump corridor. The jump drive can sort of compensate for a little bit of you being off center. And I think the Albedo jump drive can too, a little bit. So your corridor is really kind of a cone. It's a pretty narrow cone. And then at the other end, it's sort of the way that the gravity works there. You can be a little bit off center, and there's still enough gravity to knock you out of jump space. And so on the other side, it's a kind of a cone too. And so that's a pretty good illustration of sort of what you're dealing with in all of that. So that's how the jump drive works. And I think that's that's a very cool idea for a jump drive. And I can do a lot with that. But let's talk about what the implications for combat are. Like, how do I defend a system if I'm dealing with guys that have a jump drive like this? How do I attack a system if I'm dealing with guys that have a jump drive like this? So the first thing is, you don't have one jump point, right? This isn't like an Alderson drive from Jerry Parnell's work, or the warp points from Starfire or something else, where like you've only got a certain number of points and they're sort of set points, etc. Basically, any place where there's a star that you've got a clear path to and you can get there in the duration of nanoseconds using your jump drive, that's a point that's a corridor that you can go to, and you can be within a broad parameter to do that jump. So there's not just one place you jump from. It's not like in CJ Cherry where the convention is you go to either the zenith or the nadir point above the star and you do all your jumps from there, et cetera, et cetera. This has got multiple jump points. If there's 5 different places you can go to, there's 5 different places you can jump from, and those 5 places are arranged on a sphere. So they could be pointing in different directions. Some of them could be close to each other, all sorts of stuff. They're sort of arranged in a sphere. And you've got one of these for every star that you can get to and every star that can get to you. Now, the default assumption with Albedo is that those two things are the same. Everyone that can get to you is the same as everyone that you can get to. I'm going to talk about that down below. Why I think that. I don't know if that's an assumption in Albedo, but I can easily envision a jump drive where that isn't the assumption. We'll talk about that. These arrival and departure areas are really quite large because you've got a fairly good chunk of distance that you can choose from. And they don't orbit, right? It's fixed on the line between the 2 stars. Got the star here, got the star here. It's fixed on that line. That's not an orbit. Stars are moving, so the jump corridors are moving at the rate that the 2 stars are going in different directions, or they may be going in the same direction. So it adjusts over time, but it's not an orbital thing. So if you want to put defenses there, your defenses are not going to be in orbit. Your defenses are going to have to use thrusters to sort of stay in place. And also those defenses are going to be some distance away. I mean, it's a big area. So where exactly do you put it? And they bear no relation to the planets in the system, which is presumably the part that you care about. Like if you've got a colony there, that's your homeworld or something, like there's no relation to the planets there. So, your planet might be on the other side of the sun, and in order for the whatever ship to get to the planet, be it for trade or to conduct an attack, it's got to go around the entire solar system. But on the flip side, you've got a lot of information, right? You know where the other stars that you can get to and that can get to you are. So you know roughly where you need to be to leave or they need to be to come in. And so you got some astrography, you got some geography of space there that will tell you how these things work out. It also means that you can tell where a ship is going. If you see a ship going in a particular direction and go to a particular jump corridor and it jumps, you know what star it went to. At least in theory, if you've got enough fuel, you could jump because you know where it's going to. You could, in theory, jump someplace else and then do an intercept, right? So I know that that guy just jumped. We're at star A. I know he jumped to star B. I also know that when he gets to star B, that he's probably, maybe I think he's probably going in this direction, and that jump corridor is going to be on the other side of the star system. But if I go this other direction, I could do a jump from A to C and maybe get back to B in time to head him off before he can do his next jump. So there's at least the possibility that you could do things like that. Well, okay, if that's a faster route, why didn't he take that route? Well, maybe like star C is another star in your empire, and if he goes there, he's going to have to deal with the local defense force, whereas you can just jump in. So there's some interesting things that you can predict. You can predict roughly where people are going to arrive. You can potentially follow people either directly or the long way around, etc. Now, there's a few things that Albedo doesn't specifically talk about that I think is potentially interesting about this jump drive for purposes of strategic combat. And that is the main one is, do bigger stars push you harder? Do they push you farther? Do they push you faster? Is a bigger star give you more oomph? And that's got some very interesting implications. That means that some stars are more strategic than others. Like that star doesn't have any resources, but it's big and it can push me a long way. And so maybe, and if it's got a clear line of sight, even better, right? So maybe I can go to that star and I can jump off that star and I can go 50 light years. It's an exception to the rule, and it takes me 50 light years. That also has the implication that courses are not reciprocal, right? So A to B doesn't necessarily imply, in this case, B to A, because if A is a really big star, it pushes me a long ways. If B is a small star, maybe B can't push me back to A. I can't get back that way. I have to go another way. Back in the days of the windjammers in the late 1800s, you had these sailing ships, steel-hulled sailing ships that were very, very fast. They were very, very fast by going down to the roaring 40s, 40 degrees latitude, southern hemisphere, and they just booked. And because the winds only blow in one direction, the winds blow west to east, the ships went west to east. And they did not turn around and go east to west. They just did a circumnavigation of the globe. And so you had to have a set of cargoes that allow you to go from A to B to C to A, as opposed to going backwards. You didn't go backwards. You just always went in the same direction because that's how you got your speed. And so these non-reciprocal courses would potentially be very, very interesting, and you could do all sorts of interesting strategic stuff with that. I'm thinking big as in gravity. So good question, Stephen. Stephen Ross just asked the question, big as in size or big as in gravity? I'm thinking big as in gravity. It also means that some short jumps may be infeasible. Like, okay, maybe there's a star that's only 5 light years away. I've got this super massive star that's my strategic thing to jump off of. And I want to go to the thing 5 light years away. But the big star pushes me so hard that by the time I drop out of jump space, I'm like in the photosphere of the other star. Maybe I collide with it. Maybe I'm so close that I can't get away from it. Or, that I can't not collide in it. Maybe it's just, and I guess some things with the relative vectors of the stars could cause stuff like that too, right? I can't make that jump because if I do, I'm on the wrong vector and I won't be able to stop myself from running into the star in time. And so you have this paradoxical situation where the star may let you jump a long distance, but it doesn't let you jump a short distance. If you want to go a short distance, you have to go someplace else first and then come back. I think all of this is fantastic. I have this image of putting it on a stellar conquest board. If you remember old Avalon Hill Stellar Conquest, where it had different colored stars that are different size and different type stars. And I can imagine just assigning them a gravity value and using different jump drives to, they can push you different directions, different distances. I really want to do something with that. Okay, I'm going to go questions in just a second, but before I do that, let's take a look at some ship art. None of these were labeled. They were just random images in the book. And so there you see a ship deploying what looks like an ACV of some sort, but it's got a weird skirt that's a little bit different than you see in other things. Here's another one that's similar to that. Oh my God, look at the size of that thing. And I don't recall seeing anything that looked quite like that in any of the deck plans, but okay, that's kind of interesting. I don't know what the hell this is. It doesn't match any of the other ships that we've seen, and it kind of implies that maybe it's a really big ship, and that's in that it rotates for spin gravity. Maybe that's the only illustration in all of the books that has a ring like that implies that maybe there's some spin gravity. I think there's like one reference in one of the books that said that exploration ships had these things, but there's no illustrations of it other than this one thing. And the last one is something it's deploying an array of some sort. And, the lower one in the right-hand corner has got all sorts of interesting things going on. The one in the left, it's sort of in the center. It looks like it's deploying like maybe a big sensor array. But what are the things that are sort of attached to it? You've got the one that's partway down. I don't know what to think of that. It kind of implies that it's a sensor array. Maybe it's building something. It could be constructing something instead, and it's not really a sensor array. I don't know. But that's kind of what I've got. So let me take a look at the questions here. Yeah, Mike, that is fantastic. Philip Banks says Scottish kilt wearing ACV could very well be. Let's see. Todd says something about games with an albedo theme, and he talks about the AA version of Rules of Engagement 2. I haven't played Rules of Engagement, which I believe is a computer game, if I'm not mistaken. I never played it. Lissa asked the question, why do they all look like suppositories? I don't know. Ask Steve Galacci. He'll tell you. Let's see. Philip Banks says magnetars would be bad for crew health. Yes, it would. He was responding to Stephen Ross, who said time to secure some neutron stars and magnetars. I will admit, okay, so like many science fiction fans, I'm a frustrated science fiction author, and I will admit that I've got a background going on that I'm working through that actually has one of the polities. They're using a jump drive like this, and one of the polities, one of the things that makes them special is they can actually jump off of neutron stars. They can actually do that, and the other people don't understand that they've got that capability. So it's like, we can't figure out where they're going, and the answer is, yeah, they're going like, instead of going 30 light years away, they're going like 200. That's why you can't find them. Okay. Oh yeah, Rules of Engagement 2 was a computer game with light lag and other hard science trappings. Andy Presby was showing me this the last time I was at his house. He's still got it on his computer, and he plays with it. Let's see. Scrolling back. Philip Banks points out black holes might be useful too. I suspect that black holes might be complicated, but hey, that gives neutron stars and black holes and magnetars all give you this idea that maybe you have a progression in your jump drive, right? You build new technology. As your jump drive gets better, you can go to things that are harder and harder to jump off of. So, my generation 1 jump drive, stay away from the black holes, stay away from the magnetars, stay away from the neutron stars. But, by the time I get to generation 4, maybe I can jump off of those things. So there's a lot of interesting things there. So Mike asked the question, does a larger star, steeper hill means that you stop farther out in the system based on the strength of the initial push? You can control to some degree exactly when you drop out, which has some interesting implications for computer technology and how do you set that up, right? You're talking about nanoseconds. So presumably you've got a computer that's really, really fast, or you're doing something where it's like it takes X amount of time for the drive field. If I set the drive setting to 4, it takes X amount of time for that field to dissipate. And so I set it to exactly the setting so that it collapses at the time I need it to collapse. But they do talk about being able to go farther in and farther out, and you can adjust that. So that makes the situation more complicated for the defenders, in terms of it increases the amount of space that you got to cover if you're going to try to play defense, right? Which sort of implies to me that you're not doing a tight blockade, you're kind of doing a loose blockade, right? You stay back far enough that you can sort of intercept anything that comes along. You might have ships in the area ready to conduct an intercept, but you're not counting on the fact that you're going to be right on top of them when they come out, because you're not going to be right on top of them when they come out, most likely. So there's a extended discussion about accuracy angles, et cetera, et cetera. Philip Banks says something about something being insanely accurate. So my take on insanely accurate is, so first of all, yeah, it's all insanely accurate. But on the flip side, one of the things that I've discovered over the years is that astronomers can do insanely accurate. And if astronomers can do it with like big telescopes and stuff, then I would expect that we can do that too. I mean, we're at the point where we can point at individual stars that are pretty far away and basically center on them and get a pretty good picture on them. And I remember this on a traveler mailing list. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was the guy who did a bunch of laser work, who was a professional astronomer and was really, really prevalent on the traveler mailing list back in the day. Somebody said, when they were talking about pointing lasers, somebody said, you don't understand. In order for that to work, you would have to be able to point that with a precision of X. And he came back and said, yeah, we do that. I'm an astronomer. I've worked at the Keck telescope. We do that all the time. That's not hard. Okay. So I'm willing to hand wave on the science fiction. Maybe it's a little bit of a hand wave. I'm willing to do it. So Eric Henry says the catching part is odd. Just turn off the FTL. No catching is required. I think part of the catching, and we'll get into this with the outsider stuff, because part of it has to do with the fact that you're in hyperspace, right? And so the thing that caused you to do the jump, this is especially true of outsider. This is explicitly true of outsider. It's implicitly true of albedo. That what the jump drive does is it pushes you into hyperspace. And it isn't necessarily that the jump drive is on while you're in hyperspace. The hyperspace was the jump drive was the initial push, and then you have to come out of it. And so something has to drag you out of hyperspace. And so it seems to me that you can easily, even if that wasn't Steve Galacci's explicit intent, and I'd have to go back and double check, you could easily sort of justify it in those terms. It makes perfect sense that you'd have to justify it in those terms. I mean, it's science fiction. Make up the rules that you want, right? Yeah, Olive points out, depends upon how far apart the stars are. In dense regions, you're going to move slowly because your jumps are going to be shorter. Out here where we are, you can probably get to 30 light years if you're going in the right direction. That's the other thing. It's like, hey, if I'm heading this way, I can do 30 light years. If I'm heading that way, I can only do like 8. because there's a cluster of stars over there. So one of the things I really like about this is that it gives space geography, which is you don't really have in, say, Star Trek. You just sort of turn on your warp drive and you zoom all over the place, and you don't really have any sort of geography. And as somebody with a master's degree in strategy, I kind of like to have some geography to wrap my brain around. I kind of think that makes it more interesting. Yeah, Philip points out you have to correct for stellar drift. Exactly. Eric points out, so a jump to Vega must align where Vega would be in 25 years because Vega is 25 years away. Yep. And so that means that you have to have, you really have to have some precise data. You're not just, going third star from the left. You have to have charts in order to get to places. So you really kind of have to be, now you're not jumping that far. So chances are you would have charts, right? Because 5 to 30 light years, you're probably that you can do. But it does sort of imply that as you go out, you're going to have observation ships that as they go out, they get better and better information, right? Because the thing is, we have issues. I forget what the current estimate is, but once you get out beyond a certain small number of light years, the error bars get a lot bigger. And it has to do with parallax measurements. The way we calculate distance is we take a measurement when the Earth is on one side of the sun. We take a measurement when Earth is on the other side of the sun. We do the math to triangulate. You get to a point where that triangulation becomes hard. And so you really, at some point, you start doing stuff off of standard candle type stuff where you go like, okay, that triangulation data seems to indicate it's about this, and we think it's this kind of star, et cetera, and that would have a luminosity of this. And so we're guessing it's, whatever. So that's why you get like a very precise number for Alpha Centauri. And then you get to like 100 light years away, and it's like 100 plus or minus 20. And so that implies that, as you slowly expand, you've got lots and lots of ships that are taking lots and lots of precise measurements as they get close enough that they can take a precise measurement. Philip Banks points out stellar motion would be a pain to compensate for it. Yep. And that jumping, the size of the gravity well would probably make jumping to larger stars easier. I hadn't thought about that. That's actually a very, very interesting observation. I like that observation a lot. Thank you. Going back, talking about how much maintenance would you need to do on your weapons in flight? Wouldn't these be treated like VLS cells, i.e. primary maintenance and replacement in port? Maybe, but you might have to do some maintenance. You certainly do testing on things like Harpoon, although Harpoon is considered a wooden round. And what they mean by wooden round is that you don't have to do anything with it. It's in the tube. You never have to do maintenance on it. But some other weapons, you do have to do maintenance on it. Weapons are complicated machines. And so there's some sort of stuff that you do at the depot, but there's other stuff like you might have to go and, lube it up every now and then or something like that. At the very least, you have to sort of run test sequences on stuff. And so it's entirely possible that you may run a test sequence and you get a fault. And it's like, okay, we know what the fault is. It's the such and such, because the such and such always breaks on these things, right? The thing's made out of spun glass, and if it's mishandled at all, or it's at some point it's going to undertake acceleration. And so even though it's something that's designed to take hundreds of Gs, that's why you have an unmanned system. Maybe something happened, right? Maybe something happened, and you need to actually put the hood up on it. Just like you need to do maintenance on helicopters. You do maintenance on helicopters all the time. Now, helicopters are being constantly used on board a ship, whereas the weapon is just kind of sitting there. But you do have to do maintenance on, the more complicated something is, the more maintenance you have to do on it. Philip Banks says something about offset shafts might be interesting. I guess that's so that you don't have, like, you fall to the bottom of the shaft under acceleration. That's always an interesting thing. Like, why would you have a long corridor? A long corridor is just a very deep pit when you're under acceleration. I know this from personal experience. And the personal experience is launching off an aircraft carrier in the COD. I had never thought, I knew intellectually what the process was. I had never stopped to ask myself the question, how is my body going to interpret this? When the catapult fires, how is my body going to interpret this more than 1 G load? I never found out exactly how many Gs I pulled. My guess is it was probably around 2. But, that's just a guess. It's hard to figure that out when you're actually in the seat because your body's going like, what the hell's going on? But so I'm sitting in the chair, right? And the way it seemed to my body was all of a sudden the chair tilted 90 degrees. And I went from looking at the aft of the airplane, because you face backwards in the carrier onboard delivery aircraft. I went from looking at the back of the aircraft to hanging from my straps at the top of a tall, empty tower. That's what it felt like. So I totally get the idea why you wouldn't want to have a long vertical shaft. Wright says some really intricate universe building. There's a lot of goodness in here. Like I keep saying, it's my favorite shit show. There are so many things in this that are broken, but oh my God, is it cool? And oh my God, do I keep coming back to it? And oh my God, did I want to do it? I've been wanting to do it on the show for like 2 years now. I'm glad I finally get around to doing it. Because there's a lot of really good things in here, even though there's a lot of problems, etc. And I'd love to see like a 5th edition. Seeing people saying glad that I'm here doing the show because they love the show. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you guys are here. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Yeah, a little bit of a discussion about whether fusion works. Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical. I've become skeptical in my old age. Let's see. Scrolling. Yeah. So Bob says last week, didn't do a show last week. I probably said last week at some point. I meant last episode, which was 3 weeks ago. I didn't do a show last week. I didn't do a show the week before. The previous one was before that, 159. And so now we're on 160. So I skipped 2 weeks. But I always do that. I say next week when I mean next show, because I know that I'm not going to do one next week, that sort of stuff. I say that all the time. Okay, so that got me to the end. Let me go back. Got back to the beginning. Now I'm going to go back and scroll back again. Todd says, any liquid fueled munition has more moving parts. Yeah. It's funny, though, with missiles are kind of weird. More moving parts, and sometimes the fuels are kind of caustic, but as a general rule, you can let liquid fuels just sit for really long periods of time. And sometimes you have more of a problem with solid fuels, although we've gotten really pretty good with making solid fuels last forever. But solid fuels are like they're like the consistency of a pencil eraser. What happens with a pencil eraser if you just let it sit? The answer is it gets dry and crumbles. So actually, solid fuel missiles have more stringent environmental requirements as a general rule than liquid fuel missiles do. Although in some cases with liquid fuel missiles, you can't keep them fueled. You have to fuel them at the last moment, but other ones are designed to be fueled forever and ever and ever. I learned all this when I took the class on how to launch a Scud. That was a really fun class. No, Delon, you did not miss last week's show. In fact, you showed up you were there for at least part of the last episode because you made a comment. Yeah, Todd points out that an interstellar society has more points of view than just parallax. So if you got multiple planets, you can be looking at it from multiple distances. That's a very good point I hadn't really thought about. That's a very good point, though. 2300 AD used real star charts, but suffered transcription errors. I remember moving heaven and earth to get those star charts. And now, like, you can just go to the internet and download them. Yeah, Philip Banks points out there's a difference with aiming a few hundred tons of telescope and lots and lots of tons of ship. Presumably yeah, that's true. That's true. And so all of these things, there's always this very interesting thing between the physics of the situation and the engineering of the situation, right? And so some of you probably have heard me say that right now, with cooperative engagement capability and naval integrated fire control counter air, we're now getting to the point where data links work the way that you would think that they worked if you only had a one-sentence explanation of data links, in that you can actually shoot off of the data link traffic, because in the real world, there's differences between targeting quality data and track quality data, and that isn't immediately apparent. And so that's a recurring theme in all throughout this sort of stuff, is like, yeah, I can tell you exactly what I need to do in order to make that work. The actual engineering of being able to do it, that's harder. This is also, incidentally, one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical about this entire there is no stealth in space thing. In Albedo, there's no stealth in space because you've got a magic fusion drive, and it takes you weeks to get any place, and so you got plenty of time to work that problem. But in the real world, sensors have requirements. Sensors have noise. Sensors are made out of real things that are not the optimal thing. They are the best that we can come up with for a given amount of money that we're willing to spend. And so you even have that with organic sensors, i.e. the human eye. Look up the color magenta in Wikipedia and read about how magenta doesn't actually exist. Where's magenta on the spectrum? The answer is it's not on the spectrum. Pink is not on the spectrum. We just think it exists, and it has to do with how eyes work, and it has to do with you've got multiple receptors in your eyes that are doing different wavelengths, and they're not perfectly split out, and your visual center in your brain is doing things like trying to figure out what the color is and display it to you. And magenta is what you get when you're tracking on one thing and you are not tracking on the other, and it's subtracting one from the other. Read the explanation. It's way better than I can do it. And so you have, in the real world, sensors have noise in them, and they have issues, and they can only be so good. And, you dump your sensors out, and they, if you dump sensors throughout the system, then they have to be durable enough to last. They may have esoteric requirements about cooling and stuff like that. They get abraded by zodiacal dust. There's all sorts of things that get in the way of perfection there. And so a lot of times the interesting thing is not what can I theoretically do, it's what can I actually do with the engineering that I have, right? Just simple things with like in the old days before Aegis, when you had two different radars, you'd have a fire control radar and you'd have a search radar. They've got different fields of view, and they may not be calibrated right. And so the one radar says it's here, and the other radar, they don't have the same center line because they're not calibrated right. If your systems aren't calibrated, you have problems. Okay, let's see. Mike asks a long question. If you can't effectively preposition interceptor forces, then in-system combat is around in-system assets and Newtonian physics based. Could be. I mean, you might be able to position interceptors nearby. You're just not going to be able to pounce immediately, because the other guy still has to, he's got an incoming vector from that star. And that's one of the things that you can work into this, right? It's like, okay, we know he's got to be moving along a line away from that star. That star is moving at such and such. So we know that his vector is going to be like this. When he gets here, in order for him to get to the target, because we think we know where the target is, so, he's going to hit the planet, right? So in order for him to get to the planet, he's got this vector, and he's got to take off He's got to compensate for the vector that he's got this way, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got a lot of information that I can use to sort of say, I think the best places to be is right there. I think right there, I can sort of hang out and I can probably intercept him, right? And you're going to be able, as the incoming guy, you're going to be able to say, okay, he's not going to be here. He's probably going to figure I'm going to be coming in here. And so he's going to be there more or less, if he's there at all, etc. And so maybe I can do something that sort of screw him up. Or, as Mike says, you might just end up saying, like, maybe the right place to defend stuff is closer to the system. The thing is, in the Albedo universe, the way you attack a planet is you drop an autonomous combat vehicle on it at a high rate of speed. And it just, it hits with a huge amount of kinetic force. Boom. Just comes in at a very high rate of speed. If you can do the intercept before you can launch those things, that's great, because then you don't have to intercept each of the arrows, right? We frequently talk in the Navy, we would frequently talk about, you want to shoot the archer, not the arrow, right? If I can shoot the bomber before he launches his missiles, it's a lot easier than shooting down the individual missiles themselves. So that's the sort of thing that we're kind of talking about here. Yep. Philip is talking about accurate stellar cartography, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, there's a lot to that. Okay. Philip Banks asks, what happens if you miss? I think the answer is you just drop out. A couple of things can happen. You drop out in the middle of nowhere. You don't drop out in the middle of nowhere. Instead, your ship's everything above the element oxygen starts to spontaneously fission, and maybe a bunch of like random pieces drop out in the middle of nowhere. Or maybe something else bad happens. In Outsider actually has a bunch of interesting parameters, because it talks about when you jump into hyperspace, you're at a quote unquote angle, and you have to come back in at a similar angle, but you're coming into a gravity well. So if you like overshoot or undershoot, you can find yourself in a situation where you can't re-embed in the normal universe. And or you might bounce off or something like that. And if that happens, your ship is just never seen it from again, and they don't know what happened to you. But I'll talk about that a little bit more next week. One of the things I really like about Outsider is he's got some really, really nice little illustrations that he puts in all this stuff. So I can next week I'll have a lot of graphics on stuff like that. Eric Henry points out that the guy I was trying to think of was Bruce McIntosh, and that is indeed who I was trying to think of. It was Bruce McIntosh. Eric Henry asks if we can have a T-shirt explanation episode with each a segment with each episode. This says super easy, barely an inconvenience. It's from the Screen Rant Ryan George YouTube videos. Where he's explaining the pitch meeting, where a scriptwriter is giving a script to a potential producer, and at some point they'll always talk about how like oh yeah, and then they have to like rewire the sun in order to make it work. Wow, that sounds really hard. No, super easy, barely an inconvenience. So that's where that came from. I'll try to do that from now on, since somebody asked for it. CJ asks, does it have any form of faster than light communication? The closest you get is message torpedoes, which are basically ACVs without a warhead. Their payload is a bunch of memory storage and radios, and so basically you have to. The short answer is no. The longer answer is they do have an autonomous vehicle that's designed to jump between systems and carry the news. And Delon showed up late. Okay, so I think I'm back to the beginning, or I'm back to where I was before. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think we're about done. And hour and 20 minutes. All right. That's kind of par for the course. I would like, as always, to say that I am honored that you guys have chosen to spend your Saturday night listening to me talk, in this case, about a comic book role-playing game that came out 35 years ago ish. Um, I'm I'm always just tickled pink that people are willing to come and spend their Saturday night with me. So thank you very much for doing that. And I plan on doing a show next week. There is a possibility I may be visiting my sister next week, if that happens, I'll put up an announcement to that effect. But by default, I plan on being there next week. And I'll see you then. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.